If you weren't on the panel earlier or in the earlier session, I just want to reintroduce myself, introduce myself. My name's Rebecca Campbell. I'm with the Colorado Society of CPAs. I'm the COO and the CLO for the COCPA. I've been there 30 years, and I tell you that because I want you to know that I've had a lot of experience helping members and non-members with state board issues, to deal with licensing issues, certificate issues, anything to do with, getting it, changing it, those types of things. So at any time, I just encourage you to, if you have questions, during this presentation, please put them in the Q&A and chat. Or after the presentation, my contact information is at the end of this PowerPoint presentation that you should have received, and you can contact me. I would love to help you if you have any questions. All right, so in the first session, we covered the organization of the board. We reviewed the State Board's website. We talked about what you need to do to get licensed. We talked about names and disclosures for individuals and your company. We also talked about what you need to do, like licensing things, stuff like that. Now, for the second session, what we're going to do is, hopefully this works the first time. Bill, can you see my screen? Does it say certificate types?
Oops, I was muted. Yeah, certificate.
Yes. Okay, great. All right. So the next topics that we're going to move into are, we're going to talk about certificate types. So there are 4 different kinds of certificate, or their statuses you can have for your certificate. So the first one is an active certificate, which allows you to perform any services for which an active certificate or valid registration is required. Inactive is the status of a certificate upon transfer of that certificate to an inactive status. So what you can do is you can apply to the State Board of Accountancy to go from an active to inactive status, okay? And we're going to talk about the requirements for these certificate types in just a minute. All right, then you can have a retired status, and we're going to talk about what the requirements are for being retired. And then an expired status. So let me tell you what an expired status is. So earlier we talked about renewal being on an odd numbered year, and for an individual certificate, you renew in November. So if the renewal goes out in November, then you have a 60-day grace period. Let's say the November 30th has gone by, your 60 days have gone by, and you still have not renewed your certificate. Your status goes into an expired status, okay? So then your certificate is there, and we're going to talk about what that means. All right, so this is just a slide to remind you when the renewal dates are. Your individual certificate will be renewed next year, November 30th of 2021, and you should have renewed your firm registration in August of this year. I know there's a lot going on with the pandemic, so hopefully you renewed your firm registration. Now, the CPE reporting period, the CPE reporting period is January 1st of this year through December 31st of 2021. We did try to get the State Board to match up the individual certificate expiration date with the CPE expiration date, but they couldn't do that because they had other boards renewing at that time. So our 2 options was to renew in November or to renew in March. So I think it was February or March in that time frame. I'm right in the middle of tax season. So the board chose November. So what happens in November is when you renew your certificate, you're going to attest that you have already or will meet the CPE requirement by December 31st of 2021. All right, so if you have an active certificate, you have to get 80 hours of CPE in the reporting period. I want to draw attention to this next sentence. Newly licensed CPAs have to get 10 hours of CPE for every quarter remaining in the reporting period. The wording in the rules sometimes confuses certificate holders. And I get a lot of questions about if you have to get 10 hours of CPE every quarter in the reporting period, and you do not have to do that. You could get all 80 hours in December. You could sit down the last 2 weeks of December right before the deadline and get all of your CPE that way if you wanted to. So now, if you are newly licensed, you have to get 10 hours of CPE for every quarter remaining. So let's do an example of what that is. Let's say it's December, we're in the middle of a reporting period, and let's say I just got licensed in December. There would be 4 quarters remaining in 2021 before the end of the year, so I would have to get 40 hours of CPE. And something to draw your attention, out of however many hours you have to get, there is a maximum of 20% in personal development. And personal development are things like time management, leadership, career development. There is a maximum of 50% for teaching and publishing, and we're going to talk about the requirements for that in a moment. And then also when you renew, not only do you have to attest that you have completed or will complete the CPE requirement, you do have to attest that you have undergone a peer review if required. Okay. So before I go on, are there any questions about the CPE? Because sometimes this is where I get a lot of questions. You can put something in the Q&A or the chat. I'm just going to check the chat here. I don't see anything listed. Just give you a second just to see if there's any questions about having an active certificate. Okay, I'm going to keep going on. All right, Bill 19-155. This is brand new. It was passed last year. What this says is a non-resident who is applying to renew, reactivate, or reinstate a certificate in Colorado who complies with the CP requirement in the holder's principal place of business automatically meets the CPE requirement in the state. So let me explain about that a little bit. We have certificate holders who have certificates in multiple states, and it gets hard to manage all of the different requirements. Nebraska might have a different requirement than Oregon, than Colorado, than Maryland. There's all different kinds of requirements. So in Colorado, if your principal place of business is not in Colorado, okay, so you are a non-resident of Colorado, but you hold a certificate in Colorado and you're renewing it or reactivating it, if you meet the CPE in the state which you have your certificate in, your principal place of business, you meet the CPE requirement in Colorado. This was passed last year during the last reporting period. The state board decided to put this bill into effect this reporting period because they didn't have the systems in place last year to be able to do that in that reporting period. So it'll take effect when you renew in 2021. I just want to stop right here just because this is a brand new requirement. Does anyone have a question? I see I have a question here in the chat. Do classes have to be registered with Nasba to count for CPA? They do not. And I do have a slide in a minute that I'm going to talk about the CPE requirements. So I'll give you more detail on that. That's a really good question. Because I have to tell you, I do get a lot of questions about registering with Nasba. Sometimes we get people calling me and asking me what our Nasba registration number is, and we don't have one. The Colorado Society of CPAs doesn't have one. Because you are not required to register with Nasba in Colorado. And remind me about that question when we get to the CPE area, because there are some things that I do want to talk about when we get to CPE. I'm going to check the chat. There's nothing in the chat, and I don't see any other questions about this specific bill, so I'm going to keep going. All right, so if you want to change your certificate to inactive, you have to give notice to the board. We had a quiz question earlier about needing to renew your status. So you do have to keep renewing your inactive and your retired status. You're not required to comply with CPE. You can put inactive CPA after your name. We talked about that in the session this morning. You can move from an inactive status to an active status. So it's reactivating it. You cannot hold out or perform any services for which an active status is required, and this does not relieve your obligation to complete CPE. And I have a slide that's going to talk about the requirements to reactivate in just a moment. All right, now we're going to talk about retired status. You also have to submit notice to the board. You have to be at least 55 years or older. You have to have a certificate in good standing for at least 15 years, and 2 of those 15 years have to be in Colorado. Again, you do not have to comply with CPE and a retired status. And retired status can be indicated after your name. So we talked about that earlier. You can say John Smith, retired CPA, and you cannot hold out or perform any services for which an active certificate is required. All right, so just a few minutes ago, we talked about the expired status. That's what happens if you do not renew and you go past your 60-day grace period. Just so you know, during that grace period, you would not be disciplined for holding out. Earlier, we looked at the policy for holding out. So you would not be disciplined if you held out during the grace period. And again, at the bottom, as with all statuses, allowing a certificate to expire does not relieve your obligation to complete CPE. All right, so if you want to go, if you're inactive, so you want to reactivate your retired or inactive status or your expired status, this is what you have to do. If it's less than 2 years, you have to get 80 hours of CPE for the reporting period immediately preceding the one that you are in, okay? Then you have to get 10 hours of CPE for every full quarter that you are currently in. So let's do an example of one I gave earlier. Let's say that I reactivated my status. So it's 10 hours of CPE for each full quarter during the current CPE reporting in which the certificate was retired, inactive, or expired, okay? So if I am in December of this year and I want to reactivate, I had to get 80 hours for the last reporting period. And then there are 4 quarters have already passed in this year, so I had to get 40 hours, okay? So now I'm at 80 hours and 40 hours, so 120 hours to reactivate. No more than 20% personal development and no more than 20% in teaching or publishing an article. If I go more than 2 years, I have to meet all the requirement for 2 years and I have to take the AICPA ethics exam. Okay, doable, not too bad. It's when you get into the 6 years or more that there's a lot more required, okay? So you have to have 10 hours of CPE for each full quarter during the current CPE reporting period in which the certificate was retired, inactive, or expired, up to 80 hours. And you have to have 1 year of experience. The experience must be obtained within 2 years immediately preceding the application date, or a master's degree or higher with a concentration in accounting. Or you have to meet the conditions for initial certification, including passing the exam, okay? All righty, so I'm gonna stop here for a minute. I won't do this on every slide, but I just wanna check. I'm gonna check the Q&A section. Does anyone have a question about what you have to do to reactivate your license? Okay, I'm going to check the chat. I don't see anything in the chat. I'm going to keep going. Okay, now here's an important part, and this was new. Not new recently, but it has been, I think in the last update we did in 2016. You have to meet the requirements for reactivation or reinstatement to active status based on the total combined period. Okay, so let's say you had retired, let's say an inactive certificate for 2 years, a retired certificate for 2 years, that's 4 years total that you then, if you try to reactivate, you have to reactivate for the rules for 4 years total. It's not whatever status you're currently in. All right, we're going to talk about the Cpe standards next. Hopefully that'll answer the question we had earlier. First of all, these are the fields of study. In the session this morning, we talk about incorporated standards. This is one thing that the State Board has incorporated, and it's the field of study. There's something I didn't talk about earlier that I mentioned right now, and that is in the State Board rules in the beginning where it has standards that are referenced by incorporation. If there is a if the incorporated references say one thing and the rules say another, so there's a conflict in what they say, the rules trump. The rules are the ones, the State Board of Accountancy rules are the ones you want to go by. So let me give you an example, because there is an example actually here in the fields of study. The State Board incorporated the Nasba, AICPA, Cpe fields of study. In the fields of study, it says that behavioral ethics is actually personal development. The State Board of Accountancy rules say ethics is ethics. Okay, so when you take an ethics course, it doesn't go towards that 20% limit you have on personal development. So that's just an example where when the rules conflict, the State Board rules apply. The other thing to notice about here is, I don't know if you've been around long enough. I've been around long enough, or I remember we had, when you reported your hours to the State Board of Accountancy, you reported them in A and B field, A and B categories. So A was technical and B was non-technical. It's been quite some time, but we were able to work with the State Board, and they updated the fields of study to include all these areas, because we have, you know, CPAs are just don't always do just accounting or just auditing or just tax. You know, there's different areas that you work in. You could be a CPA in industry. You could be one in your firm working with personnel or HR, or working in advisory services. So now we have a wider field of study from which you can get your CPE from, with that 20% limit on personal development. All right, this was a question I think Tammy asked me earlier. Documentation, you have to keep it for 5 years. So I hope she's on and listening. This is a really important slide that I want to draw some attention to. So your certificate of attendance has to have these items: the sponsor name and contact, your name, the program title, field of study, date it was offered, location if applicable, we're all online now, type of instruction or delivery method. So today it would be webcast, number of CPE hours completed, and verification of CPE sponsors. The reason I want to bring your attention to this slide is because I have had certificate holders call me who have been audited by the State Board, and something is missing on their certificates of this required information. So what happens is, if you're missing any of this information on your certificate, the State Board's going to ask you for the missing information. And if you can't provide it, then that certificate will be thrown out. And if you only got 80 hours of CPE, you're really going to need that certificate to meet the requirement, because this is what happens. If you renew your license in November and you attest that you have or will meet the CPE requirement, you get audited, you send your certificate in. One of them doesn't meet the requirements, it gets kicked out. Now you're short on your CPE, and what have you done? You have attested that you have met the CPE requirement when you really haven't. And so you don't want to put yourself in that spot. So I would keep this. This is very important information, and I would make sure that you have all of this, that you have all this on your certificate. The other thing, I just want to say something back here, and that is, I also want to encourage you to keep all of your certificates online somewhere. So store them up in the cloud. Do not have these certificates of attendance in your desk or in a file cabinet in your work or your home. The reason I say this is, I don't know if you probably remember, if you're here in Colorado, a few years back when we had a lot of flooding up in the mountains in the Boulder, I believe it was up in the Boulder area. And I know of a particular member that we had whose home got flooded, and her certificate of attendance, they got ruined in the flood. And the State Board of Accountancy has to go by the rules, you know, to come and say, you know, I can't prove that I met the CPE requirement because I had a flood and I don't have copies of my records. You know, they have rules they have to follow. And so you really have to make sure that you have those certificates available. I see we have some questions in the Q&A. I'm going to mention one thing and then I'll answer those. The other thing that you really need to make sure is that if you leave your place of employment, whether it's a firm or your industry, make sure you take those certificates of attendance with you, your CPE information with you. That's another type of phone call that I get a lot, is I left the firm and I'm having trouble tracking down somebody in the firm who can get me my CPE certificates. So if you have an active certificates, I just think you should, you know, you want to guard that information, you know, just protect it and make sure that it's somewhere where you can access it all the time, and make sure that you can get to it. Someone's asking, Bill, or Jordan, if you're still here, no one has seen polling questions. Okay, so the first question
your next one is coming up right now on your next slide.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you. Here's a question. What do you fill out for location if it's a webinar like this where you watch the webinar? It would be webinar. So webinar, webcast is going to be the location. If it's a self-study program, it's self-study or on demand. We don't need the instructor. Is that a change? Yeah, you don't have to have the instructor on the documentation, on your CPE documentation, Tammy. You only have to have these items. And you know, Tammy, you're asking if it's a change. I don't remember a time when we had to have the instructor's name. I could be wrong about that, but these are the things that you need to have on your certificate. All righty, here's policy 50-3. I've tried to incorporate some of the policies as they apply to the rules that we're talking about. The State Board did pass a policy, and this policy is specifically about the CR&R course. So you can only claim, so let's say that we're taking the CR&R course and I keep talking and you just can't get me to be quiet. And instead of 1 hour, we're on here 2 more hours. So we've done 3 hours of CR&R today. If you attended the hour earlier, this hour, and then another hour. Well, you can only claim 2 hours of CR&R ethics in your CPE requirement. If you have excess hours, you can count that as specialized knowledge. So let's say, like my example, I talked for 3 hours, you could claim 2 hours of ethics CR&R and then 1 hour specialized knowledge, okay? And just a reminder, in case you weren't in on the session that I was speaking at this morning, CR&R is only required if you are newly licensed within 6 months before or after, if you're trying to reactivate or reinstate, okay? You can take CR&R to renew your certificate, but it's not required if you are not in one of those statuses. Okay, true or false? You can claim, hopefully this one will be easy because I talked about this a little bit earlier. You can claim CPE credit for teaching, writing a book, and publishing an article. And be sure you want to answer this question so you can get CPE credit. And while you're answering this question, I'm going to check the chat to see if there are any. Okay, we did have a question. I'm going to answer this question while we're waiting for the results of the true or false question to come up. What is the difference between an instructor and a program sponsor? That's a really good question, Bridget. So the Colorado Society, let me give you an example. The Colorado Society hires instructors to teach. Great, everybody got that. 92% true. So you're right, it is true. You can claim credit for teaching or writing. Let me go back to this question that Bridget was answering. The Colorado Society will, for example, hire an instructor from the AICPA to teach a class for us. Let's say it's an accounting and auditing class. The AICPA is the provider. The Colorado Society is the sponsor. Okay, so we are sponsoring the course. And then let's say Bill Wagner's teaching the course, he's the instructor. So whoever is hosting the course is the sponsor. The sponsor, there are all kinds of requirements in Nasba, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, as far as documentations and requirements we have to meet to be a sponsor. Let me just check to see if there's any other questions. I don't see any other questions in the chat. Thank you for asking that, Bridget. I'm going to look in the Q&A. I don't see any new Q&A. All right, we're going to keep going. All right, so it's true. You can get credit for teaching. So there are very specific requirements for claiming teaching credit. And the reason they had that is because they didn't want someone who teaches, let's say that you're teaching a class over and over again, and it's the same material you're teaching every year. When you take a CPE class, it has to enhance your professional competence. So you have to, when you teach to claim it, it must enhance your professional competence. And it has to be taught for the first time or substantially revised. I see I have a question in the Q&A. I'm going to finish on teaching credit and then I'll answer your question next. So to claim teaching credit, you have to have the name and contact information of the CPE program sponsor. You have to have verification from the sponsor of the number of hours taught. So me being the sponsor, if you taught for me, I would issue you a certificate for that. And I just want to stop for a minute. If you're claiming CPE credit for teaching, you can claim, I think I have a slide about this in a minute, but I'm going to expand here some thinking about it. When you teach, you get the time that you taught plus double the preparation time. So let's say I teach a 4-hour class. I can claim 4 hours of CPE, and then I can claim 8 hours of preparation time. So that's 24 hours of CPE I can claim. And the rules are a little different for a panel. So we're going to talk about a panel in a minute. The sponsor issues you a certificate for the hours you taught, but it is up to you to claim your hours of preparation because only you know how long it took you to prepare. And you and I know teaching a 4 or 8 hour class, you prepare way more than the 8 or 16 hours you can claim, but that's how the rules work. You have to have an attestation from a third party that can be the sponsor, developer, or author that the activity is new or substantially required. Okay, so let's pretend I teach a class on professional writing. I can't teach that class on professional writing unless it's been substantially updated, and I think it would be hard to make a case for that. Whereas if I was teaching a tax update course and we have tax changes every year, I can make a case that it was substantially updated. You have to provide a statement on how the activity maintained or improved your professional competence. You have to provide the activity or course syllabus and your qualifications to teach that course. All right, I'm going to go up here into the Q&A. One of the fields of information is missing from the certificate. Can you just write in the missing piece of information? It has to be reissued. You can't just write it in. You have to have that reissued. And Tammy, that's where a lot of people, and thank you for that question, it's a good one. That's where people get caught, is because they have a certificate, it's missing information, they've gone to a provider where they can't track it down, or they're trying to get with the old company or old firm they used to be to try to get information from them. And so that's where people get caught. So that's why I just encourage you, every time you get a certificate, just take that extra step and make sure that it has all the information that you need on it. It'll just save you a lot of heartache later. All right, so I mentioned a few minutes ago, panel presentations are different, and they're different because you have to take the total numbers of your presentation time divided by the numbers of presenters. So let's take this example here. You can see this was a COCPA event, and we had 4 panel members, and the presentation went for an hour. Well, I have to divide that by 4 presenters. So now they have earned 15 minutes of CPE. They get double that time in preparation. So now they have 45 minutes of CPE. Well, with panel presentations, this is where the catch comes in. When you claim CPE credit, you have to earn the first hour before you can claim a half an hour of CPE credit for a live presentation. This does not include self-study. So if I go to a live presentation, I have to earn the first hour before I can claim only a half an hour. So that's just like a little bit of a catch that I just wanted to talk to you about or draw your attention to. And then also, it has to be presented for the first time or substantially revised. Again, name and contact information of the program sponsor, verification of the panel hours. All of this information is the same as if you were documenting speaking. I'm going to check the chat here. It looks like there's a chat question. No, it was just somebody needed help. All right. I'm going to go to this next slide and then I'll check again. Oh, it looks like we have another question here. Oh, so the catch, Tammy, was that if you had a panel presentation, if you participated on a panel presentation and you only spoke for 15 minutes because it was an hour-long presentation and there were 4 presenters, you only get 15 minutes of presentation time because there were 4 presenters divided into that hour, and then you get a half an hour for preparation time. You only had 45 minutes of total CPE you can claim, but you have to have 1 hour earned before you can claim less than an hour of CPE on something. So that was the catch. If I didn't explain that good, just please go ahead and type in the Q&A. Okay, great, thank you. All right. If you publish an article or book, you can get CPE credit. You have to have proof of publication and an independent review of the article or book. I think this is really important because I had a question from someone about, can I get credit for my blog? I really wouldn't try to get credit for my blog. They really want that independent review. I mean, I guess you could, you could technically get somebody to review your blog and to write up the review, but I think, I think it's good to be on the conservative side when you're claiming CPE credit for something. So making sure that it's a published article or book. Summary of the hours with the detail, time spent, days, research performed, fields of study, and then again, how it maintained or improved your professional competence. All right. You can get credit for college or university work. I put the Nasba standard, it's S16-5. So if you're on a semester system, you can get 15 hours of credit, and you can get 10 hours of credit if you're on the quarter system for 1 credit. Also, I want to bring your attention to classes used for licensure cannot be used to meet the CPE requirement for renewal. So let me give you an example. This is the example I talked about earlier. Let's say that I'm trying to reactivate my certificate, and it's December of this year, and I got, 80 hours for the, the prior reporting period. I got my 40 hours for this period because I'm four quarters into the year. I got my 120 hours of CPE. Now I'm licensed. What's next? Well, what's next is I have to get 40 hours for every recorder remaining in the period, because there are 4 hours left in the year 2021, 4 quarters left in 2021. I have to get 40 hours. I cannot use any of the CPE from 2020 that I used to get licensed. I have to get an additional 40 hours. So in reality, in a 2-year period, you could have gotten 160 hours of CPE. The other thing that I want to mention to you, I think it was, I'm not sure if I brought your attention to it earlier, but if you are changing statuses, if you are in a renewal period, so let's say the information went out from the State Board of Accountancy, it's November, it's time to renew your certificate. Do not try to change the status of your certificate during a renewal period, okay? Because you haven't gotten the CPE requirement. That's the thing that people call me about. I haven't gotten my CPE, should I go to inactive? There is a process for you to apply, and we mentioned that earlier, and change your status to inactive. And you may or might not get it done in the grace period. The State Board, they have systems. I just really recommend you don't try to change your status during a renewal period. So get it done before or after. And if you do go to an inactive certificate status and then you want to reactivate, like I mentioned, in a 2-year period, you could have had to have gotten 160 hours of CPE. That's a lot. I do get a lot of, not a lot, but sometimes I get calls from CPAs in industry saying, I let my certificate expire or into inactive status because I'm in industry, my employer doesn't pay for my CPE, and I really, I don't use it. So I just let, it go into inactive status or expired status. But then what happens is when they try to change a job or something and they really want that certificate on their resume, they're going to hold out, and you have to be an active certificate holder to hold out, or you have to say CPA inactive. Talked about that earlier. You're going to have to do, if you're searching for a job, you're going to have to make up CPE to get reactivated. So if you have an active certificate, and it's at all possible, try to get your CPE in. If you're in a situation where your employer doesn't pay for it, there's a lot of places out there that you can get CPE packages, that last for a year. We have one where you can pay one price, it goes for a year. You could use it during that whole certificate period to get your CPE. All right, there's something here in the chat. Do you have to save the slides or other information from the class, or is that the only proof you need? So that's a really good question, actually. So we're going to talk about this in a minute, but the State Board of Accountancy adopted the AICPA Nasba Cpe standards, and those standards require the sponsor to keep that information for 5 years. So you, as the attendee, you have to keep your certificates for 5 years, but the sponsor has to keep the materials, handouts, copies of the certificates. We have to keep all of that for 5 years. So you do not have to keep a copy of your materials. All right, here's another question. If I relocate to another state and want to switch my license to the new state, how do I notify Colorado so it doesn't show my certificate is expired? You're just gonna, if you don't renew, you're just gonna, this is what I would recommend you do. Reciprocity is the way you want to go. So let's say you're in Colorado, you move to Wyoming, let's say. What you want to do is I would keep my certificate active in Colorado, and then in Wyoming, apply for your certificate in Wyoming, because I always recommend you have an active certificate where your principal place of business is and where you live. So it's much easier in Colorado, for example, for someone coming in to get reciprocity than to apply for a new certificate status. So if you're moving to another state, I just recommend you keep up your certificate in Colorado. And then when you get licensed in that new state, if you don't want to keep up your Colorado certificate, then you could just let it expire. But with that said, with the new rule in Colorado for renewal, let's say you move to Wyoming, you're keeping, that's your principal place of business and you live there, you're meeting the Cpe requirements in Wyoming, you can just renew your Colorado certificate in an inactive status and use the Cpe requirement that you got in Wyoming for your Colorado certificate here. That's that new rule that we talked about, and you will do that through an attestation function. So I hope I answered your question. If I didn't, please post and let me know and I'll answer your question. All right, here's another thing that I want to draw your attention to: specialized industry programs. We all know that we're all, a lot of times we're working in specialized industries. Like, let's say that you specialize in banks and you need to take classes on banking regulation or consulting or something that really helps your clients who are in the banking industry. But that particular provider did not issue you a certificate. You can submit something under this rule 1.7. I wrote chapter here, but it's rule 1.7. You can get sponsored documents to say that you completed or attended the course. You have to have a statement. So what you have to do as a certificate holder is that you have to demonstrate that this provider of CPE met the requirements of a regular activity that satisfies the joint standards. So the joint standards require me as a sponsor to have certain things in my advertising. I have to have certain things, even if it's an on-site program. I want to bring that to attention, which I'll talk about that in a minute, but there's certain things that have to be in my advertising. I have to have a quality technical review done on the program in advance. There's certain things that have to be on my evaluations. There's certain things that I have to have on the certificate of attendance. So if you are trying to get a course to qualify, you have to prove that it meets those requirements of the joint standards and then how the CPE was claimed. This is another area where I encourage you not to do it. I encourage you to be conservative. Get a certificate of attendance. Make sure you have it and make sure that the vendor that you attended the course with follows the Nasba AICPA rules, okay? So let me tell you this, the State Board of Accountancy requires you, the certificate holder, to make sure any course that you attend, that sponsor meets the requirements of the State Board of Accountancy, okay? I do know of certificate holders in the last audit who took classes. There was by a vendor who did not meet those standards, and their certificates were not accepted by the State Board of Accountancy. So I had a question earlier about, does the sponsor of the course have to register with Nasba? No, they don't. Do you want to make sure that they follow the rules of Nasba? Yes, you do, because the Colorado State Board of Accountancy incorporated those rules into the standards. So I hope that helps. All right. All right, we're gonna do another question here. Just to make sure you're still there and to get your CPE, make sure you're still awake. So Colorado certificate holders, to claim, can you claim CPE credit for micro or nano learning? Okay, I'm gonna wait and I'm gonna just wait a minute while people answer this question, and then we'll see what the results are. Jordan or Bill, or oh, there we go. Okay. Actually, this is true. All righty. So the State Board of Accountancy in 2016 adopted or incorporated the new rules around nano learning. So nano learning is CPE in a 10-minute time frame. I don't know about some of you, but I have to be honest, a few years ago, I was very skeptical. I thought, well, what can I learn in a 10-minute time frame? And I attended this class and I attended a demo, and it was by the big firms, and they were showing a CPE 10-minute credit where they were showing how to figure out a particular line on a Form 1040. And I learned something. So nano learning is really, I think, will come into its own, because with nano learning, let's say I take an 8-hour CPE class and there's been some kind of tax change, and it's a small one, so I don't need to take another CPE class, but I could take a nano learning class to learn that additional information and get credit for it. You do have to pass a test. It's considered a form of self-study, and you have to get 100% on the test. Here's another question. Do you have to submit an evaluation of the course to get credit? Yes, you do. That is a requirement of the Nasba CPE rules. All right, I'm going to speed it up just a little bit because I have a lot of information to get through, and I've noticed we have less than 15 minutes. So I'm going to try to go a little bit faster, but please, if you have a question, please post it. There are some hardship exceptions for the CPE requirement. You can submit a written request. I just want to caution you about this. So in my session earlier this morning, I talked about the makeup of the board. It's 5 CPAs and 2 public members. These are the people who are reviewing your written submission for a hardship request not to meet the CPE requirement. In the past, it had to have been some significant event for them to grant it. Let's say that you were to say, so let's say the reporting period is the end of 2019, and December of 2019, on December 15th, I got in a car accident and I didn't fulfill my CPE requirements, and I'm 40 hours short, or I'm 60 hours short. They're going to ask, why are you waiting till December to get all your CPE requirements? Like in the past, I've noticed it had to be some significant hardship.
Sorry, I'm trying to get the rest of the polling questions in because we have 3.
I'm going to keep going.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm going to keep going. I'm going to do some super fast here, and I apologize for having to try to get this information in quickly. You have 30 days if the state board notifies you that you are deficient on CPE to answer 30 days from the date of the notice to provide further evidence that you have met the CPE requirement. Okay. So, and if you do not meet the CPE requirement, you can get audited. You can be put in another audit. There is a policy that this division staff may monitor and audit CPE. And you can be put in another audit if you've been previously audited, if you were approved for an extension, if there was failure to meet the CPE requirement, or you have been disciplined. So I just want to let you know you can be in more than one audit. Audits for the 2018-19 State Board of Accountancy said earlier in the spring it would happen in the fall of 2020. I was at a meeting and they have not sent out the audit letters yet. And I think it has to do with all the things that we're dealing with the pandemic. So there is an audit coming. I just don't know when you'll get the notices. Policy 50-4, continuing education audit discipline. So in your materials, you'll see this slide. If you are deficient of 80 hours, you could get a $750 fine, an additional $100 if ethics is missing. And if you fail to respond to the board, you can get a fine of up to $1,000. Just one quick note, I want to encourage you, if you are deficient, if you get to the end of a reporting period and you are deficient on your CPE, I encourage you to self-report. It's better for you to self-report, get your CPE hours, than to get into an audit and find out that you're short CPE hours. So I encourage people to self-report. I see I have a question, but I'm going to keep going through the slides, and then we'll have questions at the end, time for Q&A. I'll stick around and answer all questions so I can keep things moving. We've talked about the Nasba AI Cpa standards. There are very specific standards for sponsors. Make sure any course you attend meets those requirements of Nasba. All right, we're going to move into peer review. All right, all certificate holders and registrants issuing a test or compilation reports must be enrolled and undergo a peer review at least once every 3 years. You must have, we talked about where you're going to attest upon renewal that you have undergone a peer review. A question that I sometimes get is if my firm, your firm upon renewal has to attest that they're undergoing peer review. So if you are, if you have your own firm, you have to attest it, but your firm will attest about peer review upon their renewal. Retention of documents. I want to bring this to your attention. Do not send your peer review documents to the State Board of Accountancy. You have to keep your peer review documents. Rule 1.8 talks about what you have to keep in your documents. You keep your documents, and then if the State Board of Accountancy audits you, then you must provide those documents to the State Board of Accountancy. You have to retain, documents must be retained until the completion of the 2 most recent subsequent peer reviews or for 5 years. All right, so keep your peer review documents, don't send them. If the State Board requires you to send in their peer review documents, you have 30 days to provide your peer review report, your registrant's letter, your acceptance letter, a letter signed by the certificate or registrant, and then the letter signed by the sponsoring organization. So if you do get this notice from the State Board, please look at Rule 1.8. Okay. Here's policy 80-4, peer review reports which contain confidential, commercial, or financial information are closed to public inspection and will be reviewed by the board in executive session or closed. So the board has 2 sections. They have a public section, which we attend, and then they go into executive session to discuss confidential information or discipline. Extensions, there can be extensions granted for health or military service or other good cause. All right. The board, there is a rule, I have not seen them do this yet, but they can require the sponsoring organization. So Colorado Society of CPAs is a sponsoring organization of peer review audits. They can require us to provide a list of registrants that enrolled or provide a list of certificate holders that have been dropped or terminated. The board can require remedial actions, including specific CPE courses. And if information in a peer review is deemed reasonable cause to initiate a complaint or investigation, so they can initiate that. All right. If you have a change in your peer review status, what you need to do, let's say you sold, merged, or dissolved your firm, you need to reach out to the sponsoring organization to find out when your peer review has to happen. All right, this is saying that peer reviewers cannot disclose or use any information that they learn in a peer review unless they have to furnish it in response to a legally enforceable subpoena. Okay, otherwise it's confidential information. You have to enroll in an approved program within the earlier of 30 days of licensure, registration, or immediately upon issuing the first attest or compilation report. Okay. If the date of licensure, registration, or issuing of the first attest or compilation report is less than 18 months, you have to have evidence of enrollment. All right, I'm going to keep going through the rules of professional conduct are there are rules of professional conduct in the rule. There are definitions. It talks about independence and integrity and objectivity. There's a section on permitted commissions and contingent fees. You have to disclose to the recipient the nature, amount, and source of any contingent fee or commission prior to performing any service or sales. All right. You also have to, if you accept a referral fee, you have to disclose to your client in writing the nature, the amount, and the source of the referral fee. You cannot, I'm just going to close this really quick. Okay. You cannot prepare an original or amended tax return or a claim for a refund for a contingency fee. There is a section here on professional competence and compliance with applicable technical standards. I do encourage you to review this. I did see a case actually last week that came up for due care, and a certificate holder was sent to executive session for due care. So be sure that you know what those are. I'm not going to cover the disclosure section right now because we're actually 2 minutes over. So I'm going to go through just a couple more things that I want you to know. The disclosure section is the same for firms as it is for an individual. So if you have any, please review the disclosures section. This is the quiz question we just had. Can you withhold copies of tax returns until the fee to prepare the tax return has been paid? And the answer is no. All right. You have
I'm going to share the last poll as well. It's off your slides, but.
Thank you. I'm going to answer this, go through these next 2 slides, and then I'll be able to answer questions for anyone. But as a certificate holder, you have to furnish a client a copy of any tax report, tax return, or other document for the preceding 5 years, and you have to do it in a timely manner. And a timely manner is 45 days. You cannot withhold it for unpaid fees. You can charge for the reasonable cost of providing the copies, and you can withhold the copies until the fee is paid. Let's see, there is definitions in here about what constitute client records. And I just want to bring your attention to this last bullet point. Computer files that include client information normally contained in the books of original entry and general ledgers are include as a definition of client records. Okay. Okay, and then upon client records, you have to keep those for 5 years. You have to make them available. And this last bullet point is something I want to make. I got this question the other day. I want to bring this to attention. Upon request, a licensee must provide to the client a copy of any computer files that constitute client records. You're not obligated to provide the software to assemble the data. All right. There's a lot more information in the rules. I encourage you to read safeguarding your client records, especially if you're a single proprietor, you have your own business. If something were to happen to you where you were to get sick or unavailable to deliver services, there has to be another person who can provide your clients with their records, and you need to make sure that they're securely maintained. There's rules in here about solicitation, declaratory orders. I encourage you, please read the rest of, I have PowerPoint slides. I'm going to stick around to answer questions because we have definitely run out of time. And at the end, like I mentioned, my phone number and my email, and then Mary Medley, our CEO, her phone number and email are here, and we are available to answer questions. I'm going to look here in the Q&A because I think we had a question. Here's the question from Tammy. How do we complete for all sessions attended with this conference, as I didn't realize evaluations were required? So I think Jordan is on here and she has information on how you can complete your evaluation. Okay, I know that people are still here. I'm going to check the chat. Is there any questions? Does anyone have a question for me? I would love to answer questions because I know at that last I had to go through things kind of quickly. Does anyone have any questions about anything I've presented, anything about practice, privilege, mobility?
Yeah, and if anybody wants to raise their hand virtually, we'll definitely get you.
Yeah, please go through. I know there's some still people on here, so I have information on practice privilege mobility. So if your principal place of business is outside of Colorado, but you do practice in Colorado, please give me a call. We can talk about practice privilege mobility if you need information on that. The firm requirements are a lot like individual requirements for having 30 days for firm registration. While I'm waiting to see if we have any questions, I want to point out there is no grace period for firm registration. Let's say that you start a new firm. You cannot perform services until your firm is registered with the State Board of Accountancy and you have your designated RP. I do want to bring your attention to the 30 days that you have to change your information with the State Board about location, dissolution, termination of the firm, legal entity change, firm name. There's a whole bunch of things here where you only have 30 days to notify the State Board of Accountancy. If the feedback forms don't ask for your name, how can they track whether you've completed it? So I may have misspoke here. We have to offer the evaluation. You don't have to fill it out. So I misspoke on Tammy's question earlier. How do we complete all, I mean, you don't have to fill it out, but I have to offer it, and there are certain things on the evaluation I have to offer. So I apologize. You don't have to fill it out. The Colorado Society, when we have classes, you do have to go online to fill out your evaluation to get your certificate, but a provider just has to provide it. So I apologize if I misspoke earlier and created some confusion there.
The link for that is actually in the chat right now.
No,
All
it was gonna be helpful, Rebecca, because we were gonna get a ton of surveys and feedback
I know, I was like,
for
yes.
your panel.
I apologize.
And we would have gotten a ton of emails tonight from people from the past, from the
Yeah.
past.
Like, I need my forms.
Yeah, so they just have to be offered. You don't have to fill them out. So I apologize. I hope you don't get any questions.
Oh, no, it's okay. If anybody does have any questions, I mean, don't hesitate to reach out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In the materials, I'm gonna stop now, but I just want to let you know there's I put in here the policy 80-9. What happens if you do not inform the board of a change? So you can get a letter of concern, a letter of admonition, and you can get fined. All righty. There's information in here on grounds for discipline. Please, like I mentioned earlier, if you have any questions, please contact me.
And the slides for Rebecca's session will be in the tax forum. So like I said earlier, if you don't have access to the tax forum yet, please reach out to one of us. We're happy to help get you set up on the tax forum so you can access all this information.
All righty. Thank you for having me. I'll stick around in case there's any other questions. I appreciate Bill and Jordan. They've been with me all day long and been online and answered questions and help us, navigate all this. So I just want to thank you.
Yeah, thanks
Thank
for your
you.
time. That was great. Especially